My wife was cheating on me. Our relationship was getting worse every day, and when she said we needed a break, I immediately knew it would lead us to divorce. The days after my confrontation with Grace felt like a blur. We were still living under the same roof, pretending for the sake of the kids. But pretending didn't erase the reality. It only made things worse. Every morning, we went through the motions. We made breakfast for Jackson and Abigail, got them ready for school, and then we spent our evenings acting like we were still the same happy couple. But every glance, every word, was laced with bitterness. I knew she was still seeing David, and she knew I knew. The tension was suffocating, but neither of us had the courage to make the first move to end things. I tried to lose myself in work, burying my head in projects that should have taken my mind off the mess my life had become. But nothing worked. The thoughts of her betrayal kept gnawing at me, wearing me down. I couldn't help but think back to when we first met, back when things were simple, before life got so damn complicated. Those memories, though once sweet, had become painful to revisit. Everything we had built together had crumbled before my eyes, and I felt powerless to stop it. Then there was Anna. She was always there, a steady presence in the chaos. Our relationship, which had once been purely platonic, had begun to blur the lines. It was unintentional at first, but as I confided in her more and more, the dynamic between us shifted. I could feel it, even if I didn't want to admit it. We spent hours talking about everything: my failing marriage, her own past relationships, life. She had been through something similar with her ex, and she understood me in a way no one else did. One night, after another brutal argument with Grace, I found myself texting Anna, asking if she could meet me for coffee. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't judge me or try to fix things. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody knew us, where I could just be myself without the weight of everything bearing down on me. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table by the window, her eyes scanning the street as if waiting for something. I sat down across from her, feeling the familiar comfort of her presence. For a while, we didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with empathy. "Rough night?" she asked softly. "You could say that," I muttered, running my hands through my hair in frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Anna. It's like, I don't even know who she is anymore. And worse, I don't know who I am anymore." Anna reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. "I get it, Ben. Believe me, I do. But you can't let her destroy you like this." Her words hit home. I was letting Grace tear me apart piece by piece, and for what? She had already checked out of our marriage, already replaced me with David, but I was still clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. I hated that part of me, the part that still wanted to believe she could change, that she would wake up one day and realize what she had thrown away. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I'm suffocating." Anna leaned in, her eyes locked onto mine. "You deserve better than this, Ben. You deserve to be happy. Don't let her make you feel like you're not enough." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. But as comforting as her presence was, there was something else lingering between us, something unspoken. I could feel the tension between us growing, and I knew she felt it too. But neither of us was ready to acknowledge it. Not yet. The turning point came a few days later. Grace had been unusually quiet since our last argument, and I knew something was brewing. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, to end the charade. I had been spending more time with Anna, and while our relationship hadn't crossed any lines yet, I knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. That evening, Grace and I sat in silence at the dinner table. Jackson and Abigail were chattering away about their day at school, completely unaware of the tension between their parents. I forced a smile, trying to engage with them, but my heart wasn't in it. Grace barely spoke, her eyes fixed on her plate. After dinner, I went into the living room, collapsing onto the couch with a sigh. Grace stayed behind in the kitchen, cleaning up, but I could hear her moving around, the clatter of dishes a constant reminder that she was still there, still a part of my life, whether I wanted her to be or not. I heard her phone buzz on the counter, and I knew it was him. David. My stomach churned with anger, but I didn't move. What was the point? She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, Grace finally spoke. We need to talk. Her voice was calm, but I could sense the weight of what was coming. I sat up, bracing myself. What is it? She walked into the living room, sitting down on the chair across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me at first, her eyes focused on the floor. I think we need to take a break. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I had known it was coming, but hearing her say it out loud still hit me like a ton of bricks. A break? I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally looked up, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Sadness? Yeah. Things have been bad between us for a long time, Ben. I think we both know that. Maybe some time apart would help. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Time apart? Grace, you've already checked out of this marriage. Let's not pretend that this is just a rough patch. She flinched at my words, but she didn't deny it. I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry, Ben. I never wanted things to turn out like this. Then why did you let them? I snapped, my frustration boiling over. Why didn't you just talk to me? Why did you run to him? Her expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw a flash of anger in her eyes. Because you weren't there. You were so focused on work, on the kids, on everything but me. I felt invisible, Ben. I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. And that justifies cheating on me? She stood up, crossing her arms defensively. I'm not trying to justify it. I know I screwed up, but I can't keep living like this. We're both miserable, and it's not fair to the kids. I stood up as well, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. So, what? You want to leave? She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. Yeah, I think that's for the best. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, after all the years we had spent together, she was just walking away. And what was worse, part of me wanted to let her go. Part of me was relieved that the end was finally in sight. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke again. I'll stay with my sister for a while. We can figure out the rest later. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She walked past me, heading upstairs to pack a bag, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. This was it, the end of everything. An hour later, she was gone. The house felt eerily quiet without her, and for the first time in years, I was truly alone. I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. The relief I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that I didn't know how to fill. I sat there for hours, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to move on from this. All I knew was that the life I had built with Grace was over, and now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jackson and Abigail's laughter echoing through the house. For a moment, I forgot everything. I forgot that Grace was gone, that my marriage had crumbled, that my life was in shambles. But the reality hit me as soon as I stepped out of my room and saw their faces. They were sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast, completely unaware of the storm that had torn through their parents' lives. I took a deep breath, plastering a smile on my face as I walked over to them. Good morning, guys. How did you sleep? Good, Jackson chirped, his mouth full of cereal. Abigail nodded, her face lighting up as she saw me. Daddy, can we go to the park today? I hesitated for a moment, my mind still spinning from everything that had happened. But then I looked at their faces, so full of innocence, and I knew I couldn't let my problems affect them. They deserved better than that. Of course we can, sweetheart. The day passed in a blur of activity. We spent the afternoon at the park, playing on the swings and the slides, laughing like everything was normal. But underneath it all, I could feel the weight of what was coming. Grace wasn't coming back, and eventually, I would have to tell them. I just didn't know how. When we got home, I tucked them into bed, reading them a story like I always did. But tonight, I couldn't focus on the words. My mind was elsewhere, drifting between the past and the uncertain future. After they were asleep, I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, wondering how I had gotten here. I had spent so much time trying to hold everything together, trying to be the perfect husband and father, and yet it had all fallen apart anyway. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I saw Anna's name light up the screen. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse from the exhaustion that had settled deep into my bones. "Hey," she replied softly. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's all just too much." She was silent for a moment, and then she said, "Do you want to come over? We don't have to talk. We can just be." I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of her words. I didn't want to be alone. Not tonight. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. 20 minutes later, I was at Anna's door, and when she opened it, the sight of her made my chest tighten. She was standing there, her face full of concern, and for a moment, I wanted to collapse into her arms and let her take all the pain away. But I couldn't. Not yet. We didn't say much as I walked inside. She led me to the living room, and we sat down on the couch, the silence between us comfortable. After a while, she reached over and took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine. The simple gesture was enough to bring me a small sense of peace. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "Just know that I'm here." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely lost after all. I spent that night at Anna's, just sitting with her on the couch, not talking much, not needing to. It was peaceful in a way that I hadn't felt in years, but also deeply unsettling. The quiet in my mind didn't last long, though. Even as Anna and I sat there, the reality of my situation weighed on me like an anchor. Grace was gone, and I still hadn't fully processed it. The kids didn't know yet, and the thought of explaining everything to them filled me with dread. I had no idea how to begin a conversation like that. What was I supposed to say? "Mom's gone because we can't be together anymore?" How do you tell two innocent children that their family is falling apart? I didn't sleep much that night. Anna offered me her guest room, and while the bed was comfortable and the room was quiet, my thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every argument, every moment of suspicion, every little sign that our marriage had been crumbling long before David even entered the picture. In the early hours of the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs. The house was dark and silent. I found Anna sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea. She must have heard me stirring and came down to check on me. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet kitchen. I shook my head, sitting down across from her. "No, my mind won't shut off." She gave me a sympathetic look, sliding a cup of tea in front of me. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for the small comfort. We sat in silence for a while, just sipping our tea and letting the stillness settle around us. "Have you thought about how you're going to tell the kids?" Anna asked gently, breaking the silence. I sighed, rubbing my forehead. "I've been thinking about it nonstop. I don't know what to say." "How do you explain something like this to a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old? Anna nodded, understanding. "It's not going to be easy, but they're stronger than you think. They'll handle it better if you're honest with them, even if it's hard." Her words made sense, but they didn't make the prospect of that conversation any less terrifying. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever, though. The longer I put it off, the worse it would be for them. They needed to know, and they needed to hear it from me. "I'll tell them tomorrow," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Anna reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You'll get through this, Ben. You're a good dad. The kids are lucky to have you." Her words should have reassured me, but instead, they made me feel like an imposter. Could I really call myself a good father when I was in the middle of wrecking their lives? I didn't know anymore. I didn't know if I was doing anything right. The next morning, I went back home early, feeling a heavy knot in my chest as I walked through the front door. The house was still quiet. Jackson and Abigail were asleep in their rooms, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to be strong for them. I spent the morning going through the motions, making breakfast and tidying up around the house, waiting for the right moment to sit them down. When they finally woke up and joined me at the kitchen table, I felt a lump form in my throat. "Hey, guys," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "There's something I need to talk to you about." They both looked at me, their innocent faces full of curiosity and trust. God, this was going to break my heart. What is it, Daddy? Abigail asked, her big brown eyes staring up at me. I took a deep breath, kneeling down so I was at their level. Mommy's not going to be living here anymore. She and we've decided that it's best if we live apart for a while. Jackson frowned, clearly not understanding. What do you mean? Where did Mommy go? She's staying with Aunt Clara for a little while, I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. We both love you very much, and that's never going to change. Abigail's lip quivered, and I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. But why can't she stay here? My heart broke. I didn't know how to make them understand. How could I explain that their mother and I had failed them? That we had let our relationship fall apart to the point where we couldn't be together anymore? They were too young to grasp the complexities of adult relationships, too innocent to understand the kind of betrayal that had torn Grace and me apart. Sometimes, grown-ups have problems that are hard to fix, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But this isn't about you, okay? This is about Mommy and me. We're still your parents, and we'll always be here for you. Jackson looked down at his cereal, his face scrunched up in confusion. Abigail, on the other hand, looked like she was on the verge of tears. I reached out to pull them both into a hug, but they pulled away, retreating into their own little worlds. I felt helpless. I had known this conversation would be hard, but I hadn't expected it to hurt this much. They didn't say much after that, just finished their breakfast in silence. I didn't push them to talk, knowing they needed time to process everything. The rest of the day was difficult. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, taking them to the park and playing with them like we always did. But there was a tension in the air, a sadness that hung over us like a cloud. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the questions they weren't asking, and I didn't have the answers. By the time I put them to bed that night, I felt completely drained. I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of everything. But nothing made sense anymore. The life I had built was crumbling around me, and I didn't know how to stop it. I called Anna later that night, needing to hear her voice. She picked up on the second ring, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, how are you doing?" she asked. "I told them," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I told Jackson and Abigail about Grace." "How did they take it?" "Not well," I admitted. "I don't think they really understand what's happening, and I don't know how to explain it to them." Anna was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. "It's going to take time, Ben. They'll need time to adjust. But you did the right thing by being honest with them." Her words brought some comfort, but the guilt still weighed heavily on me. "I don't feel like I did the right thing. I feel like I'm failing them." "You're not failing them," Anna said firmly. "You're doing the best you can in an impossible situation." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. I wasn't sure I believed her. In the weeks that followed, Grace and I began the process of separating our lives. She stayed with her sister, and we communicated only about the kids. The distance between us felt like a relief at first, but it didn't make the pain go away. Every time I looked at Jackson and Abigail, I felt the weight of what we had done to them. Grace came by on weekends to spend time with the kids, but our interactions were brief and strained. We avoided talking about anything other than practical matters. There was no point in rehashing everything that had gone wrong. We both knew where we stood. But despite the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still tethered to her. Our lives were too intertwined to fully separate, and it felt like I was living in limbo, caught between the past and an uncertain future. During this time, my relationship with Anna continued to grow, though neither of us pushed it further than friendship. We both knew that diving into something new while my life was still in turmoil wasn't a good idea. But the connection between us was undeniable, and it brought me a sense of stability that I desperately needed. We spent a lot of time together, talking about everything: life, love, mistakes, and regrets. She was my rock, the one person who understood me in a way no one else did. But I knew that eventually, we would have to face the reality of our situation. We couldn't keep dancing around the growing feelings between us forever. One evening, as we sat together on her back porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Anna finally brought up the subject we had both been avoiding. "So, what happens next?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what the answer was. I cared about her, more than I wanted to admit, but my life was still a mess, and I didn't want to drag her into it. She deserved better than that. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm still trying to figure everything out. Anna nodded, her gaze focused on the fading light in the sky. I get that. I do. But we can't keep pretending like this isn't happening, Ben. We can't keep ignoring what's going on between us. She was right. I knew she was. But that didn't make it any easier to face. I don't want to hurt you, I said quietly. And I don't want to make things more complicated than they already are. Anna turned to look at me, her expression soft but serious. Life is complicated, Ben. It's always going to be complicated. But that doesn't mean we should run from what we feel. Her words hung in the air between us, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. I could feel the pull of her presence, the weight of everything we had been through together, and I knew that I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. I care about you, Anna, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where this is going, but I don't want to lose you. She smiled, reaching over to take my hand. You're not going to lose me, Ben. We'll figure this out together. And just like that, the weight on my chest lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe there was a way forward. Maybe things didn't have to be as broken as they seemed. As the days went by, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I spent more time with Jackson and Abigail, trying to make sure they felt safe and loved, even in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of days when I felt like I was barely holding it together. But I knew I couldn't give up. I had to be strong for them, even when I didn't feel strong for myself. Grace and I eventually started discussing the logistics of our separation, custody arrangements, finances, and everything in between. It was a painful process, but at least we were both committed to making sure the kids came first. There were no more explosive arguments, no more accusations. We were past that. Now, it was about picking up the pieces and moving forward. As for Anna, our relationship continued to evolve. We weren't rushing into anything, but there was an undeniable connection between us that neither of us could ignore. She had become an integral part of my life, and I couldn't imagine going through all of this without her by my side. One evening, a few months after Grace and I had officially separated, Anna and I sat together in my living room, talking quietly while the kids slept upstairs. It was one of those rare moments of peace, where everything felt like it might just be okay. You know, Anna said, her voice soft, I've been thinking about what you said, about not wanting to hurt me. I looked at her, unsure of where she was going with this. Yeah. She smiled, leaning in closer. You're not going to hurt me, Ben. I know what I'm getting into, and I'm here because I want to be. We'll take things slow, figure it out as we go, but I'm not going anywhere. Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to come together. I don't know what I did to deserve you, I said, my voice full of gratitude. She laughed softly, shaking her head. You don't have to deserve me, Ben. We're in this together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. Life didn't magically become easier after that. There were still difficult days, still moments where the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. But with Anna by my side, and with the kids as my anchor, I knew I could keep moving forward. Grace was no longer a looming presence in my life, and the bitterness that had once consumed me had started to fade. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't dwelling on what could have been or what had gone wrong. I was focused on the present, on rebuilding my life and being the father my kids deserved. And as for the future, I didn't know what it held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't stuck in the past anymore. I was ready to face whatever came next, with Anna by my side and my kids as my guiding light. Months passed, and life slowly found its new rhythm. The initial shockwaves of the separation had subsided, and though things weren't perfect, I was learning to navigate the new normal. Grace and I had settled into a co-parenting routine. There was no animosity left between us, just a shared commitment to make this as easy as possible for Jackson and Abigail. It wasn't the life I had envisioned for my family, but it was working. The kids were adjusting, too, in their own way. They had questions, of course. Why can't mommy come back? Or, why don't we all live together like we used to? It was never easy to answer, but I learned to be as honest as I could while still protecting their innocence. They needed reassurance that the world wasn't falling apart, even if, for a while, it had felt like it was. As for Anna and me, our relationship had blossomed into something solid and real. We weren't rushing, weren't trying to replace what had been lost. Instead, we were building something new, slowly and carefully, as we both healed from the past. She had become an essential part of my life, but even more importantly, she had become part of the kids' lives. Jackson and Abigail adored her, and the way she interacted with them, patient, kind, understanding, made me fall for her even more. The complexity of moving on from a broken marriage wasn't something I could have predicted. I had thought the hard part would be the separation itself, but in truth, the hardest part was learning to live with the scars it left behind. There were days when I still felt a pang of sadness for what Grace and I had lost, not because I wanted to go back to her, but because of the dreams we had once shared. It was hard to let those go completely, but little by little, I was learning to embrace the future rather than dwell on the past. The anger I had felt towards Grace had faded into something quieter, acceptance, maybe even a kind of understanding. We were different people now, and while our time together had ended in pain, it hadn't been all bad. We had 2 beautiful children, after all, and for that, I would always be grateful. The breakthrough moment came one crisp autumn afternoon. Jackson had a soccer game, and I found myself sitting in the bleachers next to Grace. We hadn't seen each other much lately outside of handing off the kids, and when we did, our conversations were short and polite. But as we watched Jackson running around the field, something shifted between us. "You're looking well," Grace said, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost hesitant. "Thanks," I replied, glancing at her. She looked different too, more at peace, maybe. "You too." We sat there for a moment, neither of us speaking, both of us just watching our son play. The air between us wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with the weight of what had happened. It was just light. "I've been thinking a lot," Grace said after a while, still watching Jackson. "About everything. About how we ended up here." I turned to look at her. This wasn't the Grace who had been defensive and cold during our separation. This was someone else, someone who had done some reflecting. "I know we didn't handle things well," she continued, "and I'm sorry for my part in that. I should have been more honest with you. Maybe things would have turned out differently." I nodded, not wanting to interrupt. There had been so many words left unsaid between us, and it felt like she needed to say them now. "I'm not saying we should have stayed together," she added quickly, glancing at me. "I think we both know that wasn't the answer. But I do wish we'd handled it better. For the kids, for each other." She paused, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. "I miss the way we used to be, Ben. Not the version of us that fell apart, but the one that was happy. I don't know when we lost that, but I'm sorry we did." I sat quietly for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right. There had been a time when we were happy. A time when we had been in love, when everything seemed possible. But that version of us had been gone for a long time, long before David ever came into the picture. "I'm sorry, too," I said finally, my voice low. "I wasn't there for you in the way I should have been. I let us drift apart, and I didn't see what was happening until it was too late." Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on the field. "Maybe we were just too young. Maybe we didn't know how to handle everything that came our way. But I don't regret our time together. We had some good years." "Yeah," I agreed, my voice soft. "We did." And that was it. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic closure. Just a quiet understanding between 2 people who had once loved each other but had grown apart. We weren't going to fix what was broken, but we were both ready to move on in a way that was healthy, for us and for the kids. That night, after the game, I told Anna about the conversation. We were sitting on her porch, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves around us. She listened quietly, her hand resting on my knee, and when I was done, she smiled softly. "That's a good step, Ben," she said. "It sounds like you both needed that." "I think we did," I agreed. "It feels different now. Like we can finally just focus on co-parenting without all the baggage." Anna leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. As the months continued to pass, my relationship with Grace became more amicable. We found a rhythm that worked, balancing the kids' schedules, splitting holidays, and attending their school events together without any tension. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I had ever hoped it could be. The kids were adjusting, too. Abigail, especially, had been struggling with the separation at first, often asking when Mommy was coming back. But as time went on, she seemed to accept that this was just the way things were now. Jackson, being older, understood more, but he handled it in his own way, quietly, thoughtfully. He didn't talk about it much, but every now and then, he'd ask a question, and I'd do my best to answer it honestly. One day, after school, Jackson came up to me while I was working in the yard. He stood there for a moment, watching me, before he finally spoke. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "Are you and Mommy ever going to get back together?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been expecting it for a while, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. I crouched down so I was at his level, looking him in the eye. "No, Jackson, we're not." He frowned, clearly trying to process that. "But why? You were happy before, right?" "We were happy for a while," I said carefully. "But sometimes things change. Sometimes, even though two people care about each other, they can't stay together. But that doesn't mean we don't both love you and Abigail. That will never change." He nodded slowly, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. It was hard to explain these things to a 7-year-old. Hard to make him understand that sometimes love just isn't enough. "But we're still a family," I added, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Just a different kind of family." Jackson didn't say anything for a moment, and then he wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug. I held him close, my heart breaking a little for him, but also feeling a sense of relief. At least now, he had some closure. As for my relationship with Anna, it continued to grow deeper with every passing day. We were still taking things slow, but it was clear to both of us that this was more than just a rebound, more than just two people leaning on each other during difficult times. It was real, and it was something we both wanted to build. She had become an important part of the kids' lives, too. They adored her, and she was amazing with them. Watching her with Jackson and Abigail made me realize just how lucky I was to have found her. She wasn't just filling a void left by Grace. She was creating something new, something beautiful. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Anna turned to me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Have you ever thought about what comes next?" she asked. I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" "I mean us. Where this is going." I paused the movie, turning to face her fully. "I've thought about it a lot, actually. I want this to last, Anna. I want us to last." She smiled, but there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I want that too. But are you ready for that? I mean, really ready?" I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm ready. I've been through enough to know that what we have is real, and I don't want to lose it." Her smile widened, and she leaned in to kiss me softly. "Good," she whispered against my lips. "Because I'm all in, Ben. I'm all in." And just like that, the future didn't seem so scary anymore. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about what lay ahead. There would still be challenges, of course. Grace and I would always have to navigate the complexities of co-parenting, and life would never be as simple as it once was. But I wasn't afraid of those challenges. Not anymore. Anna and I continued to build our life together, slowly but surely. We spent weekends with the kids, went on small trips, and even talked about the possibility of moving in together someday. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't forced. It was just right. The scars from my marriage to Grace would always be there, but they didn't define me anymore. I had learned to live with them, to accept that they were part of my story, but not the end of it. And in doing so, I had found something new, something worth holding on to. The final piece of closure came one summer afternoon, almost a year after Grace and I had separated. We were both at a family event for Jackson's school, standing off to the side while the kids played with their friends. Grace looked over at me, a small smile on her face. "You look happy," she said, her tone warm. "I am," I replied honestly. "I really am." She nodded, her smile widening. Good. You deserve to be. So do you, I added, meaning it. For the first time, I saw true contentment in her eyes. She had found her peace, just as I had found mine. As I watched Jackson and Abigail running around the field, laughing and carefree, I realized that everything had turned out the way it was supposed to. Life wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was good. It was real, and it was mine. I had found my way back to myself, and that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift of all.